Imagine for a moment that your mind is not a container of thoughts, but a living landscape, one that's constantly shifting with weather you didn't consciously choose. Some days it's open and bright. Other days, a heaviness settles in without explanation. And then there are those moments, rare but unmistakable, when you sense something underneath it all, something steady, something clear, something that feels like it belongs to you in a way nothing else does. Now, stay with this inner landscape for a second. Notice how, even in your heaviest moments, there is always a small pocket of clarity somewhere inside you. It might be faint, it might be quiet, but it's there. And yet somehow, even though that clarity exists, there are times when you can barely reach it. It's as if your thoughts begin drifting in directions you didn't intend. Pulled by some subtle force that nudges your attention off-center, you feel a truth rising inside you, but a different voice, familiar, anxious, insistent, pulls you away from it. That tension is the first sign of what we're calling the mind net. Not a net made of ropes or steel, but a web of influences woven through your thinking. It doesn't show up dramatically. It slips in through tiny openings, an old belief, an unresolved memory, a moment of vulnerability, a fear you haven't questioned in years. It doesn't overpower you, it redirects you, just a few degrees off your inner alignment. But those few degrees are enough to make you doubt what you already know. You've probably felt this in moments when your whole being sensed a clear direction, but then your mind threw a shadow over it. Suddenly you weren't sure anymore. The clarity didn't disappear, you just lost sight of it. The way stars fade when city lights drown them out, the signal was still there. The noise got louder. The strange thing is how natural that noise can feel. The mind net doesn't shout. It mimics. It imitates your tone, your insecurities, your survival instincts. It convinces you that its voice is your voice, its fear is your fear, its hesitation is your caution, its distortion is your logic. And because it uses pieces of your own history as building material, it's easy to believe it. But listen closely and you'll notice something. The mind net never expands you. It contracts you. It never guides you toward what feels true. It pushes you toward what feels safe, familiar, or predictable, even when those things work against your growth. It bends your perception just enough that you stop trusting the quiet guidance inside you, the one that doesn't need to justify itself. Think back to moments in your life when you sensed a deeper knowing, an instinct telling you someone wasn't being honest, or that a certain opportunity was aligned, or that you needed to walk away from something draining you. You felt it clearly, but then came the countercurrent, second-guessing, doubt, the replay of old fears, the imagination of worst-case scenarios. The clarity didn't vanish. It got buried beneath all the noise that rose to override it. That override is the mind net in motion. It doesn't need to defeat you. It only needs to distract you. It doesn't need to steal your clarity. It only needs to pull your attention away from it. And as long as your attention is elsewhere, lost in anxiety, caught in old narratives, tangled in assumptions, the deeper signal within you stays out of reach. But here's where something important begins to shift. Once you recognize that not every thought reflects your truth, you create space, space to breathe, space to observe, space to question the automatic impulses that used to run your inner world. You start noticing tiny discrepancies, the way a thought feels heavier than the situation, or how a fear escalates too quickly, or how a suspicion arises without real evidence. These discrepancies are cracks in the illusion, and when you look through those cracks, you begin to see something simple but revolutionary. Your thoughts are not all originating from the same place. Some thoughts rise from your deeper self, quiet, calm, steady. Others rise from old wounds, loud, urgent, repetitive. And still others aren't yours at all. They're echoes of influences you absorbed from the world around you, from people you once tried to please, from environments where you learned to survive rather than express who you really are. When this understanding dawns, the entire landscape inside you shifts. You no longer assume that every voice within carries authority. You start evaluating tone, sensation, intention. You start sensing which thoughts are aligned with your inner center and which are pulling you away from it. And as that awareness grows, the mind net begins to lose the subtle advantage it has held for so long. Because the mind net relies on invisibility, it relies on your unawareness. The moment you begin seeing how it operates, the moment you sense the difference between your signal and the noise, its influence weakens not through resistance, but through recognition. And in that recognition, something inside you begins to rise. A steadiness, a quiet strength, a sense that you're not walking blindly anymore. You're beginning to see the architecture of your inner world. In that emerging clarity, the path toward the next unfolding becomes possible. The journey toward recognizing the signal beneath all thought. The inner guidance that's been calling you back to yourself long before you knew how to hear it. If you follow that sense of emerging clarity closely, you'll notice something fascinating begin to happen. When the mind net loosens its hold even slightly, there's an opening, like a small clearing appearing in a dense forest. And through that clearing, something familiar starts to shine through. Not loud, not dramatic, not demanding, more like a steady pulse, a quiet warmth, a subtle inner orientation that feels older than any belief you've ever held. It's the signal that has always been there beneath your thoughts, waiting for the noise to settle enough for you to feel it. This signal doesn't arrive in the way the mind expects. It doesn't deliver step-by-step instructions or arguments. It doesn't come with a proof or explanation. It simply reveals itself as a tone, a resonance, something unmistakably true, even when you can't articulate why. And the moment you notice it, even faintly, there's a sense of recognition that moves through you. The kind of recognition that says, I've known this before. I've felt this before. This belongs to me. You might recall moments in your life when you were about to make a choice that didn't feel right. Everyone around you might have said it was the logical thing to do. Your mind might have tried to justify it, but somewhere deep inside, you felt a tightening, a quiet resistance that didn't match the story your thoughts were trying to tell. That resistance wasn't fear. It was the signal trying to get your attention. And you've had the opposite experience too. Times when everything looked uncertain, yet something inside you felt strangely calm. You couldn't explain it to anyone. You weren't even sure you could explain it to yourself. But that calm was real. It held you. It steadied you. It pointed you toward a direction without forcing you to go. That calm was the signal as well. The signal has many ways of speaking, yet it never imposes. It's the one voice within you that doesn't try to scare you, rush you, or break you down. It doesn't posture. It doesn't perform. It doesn't compete with the distortions. It simply continues unchanged, unbent, untouched, patiently waiting for you to lean toward it. But because it's subtle, it's often overshadowed by louder influences. Fear has volume. Old patterns have momentum. Conditioning has familiarity. The signal has none of that. Its strength is not loudness, it's consistency. It never shifts its tone. Even when your emotions are in turmoil, it never contradicts itself. Even when your circumstances do. It's the one steady thing within you that doesn't depend on what's happening outside. There's a reason so many people feel disconnected from themselves without knowing why. It's not because the signal disappeared. It's because their attention has been trained to prioritize noise over truth. From a young age, we learn to override our inner knowing in exchange for approval or safety or predictability. And each time we do, We drift a little further from that inner resonance, not because we're broken, but because the world trains us to trust everything except ourselves. Yet the signal never withdraws. If you stop for even a moment and let your awareness drop beneath the surface of your thoughts, you'll feel it again. Sometimes as a soft pull, sometimes as a gentle nudge, sometimes as a quiet clarity that rises without effort. It doesn't push you toward anything. It simply illuminates what's already aligned with who you are. And here's what's so important. The signal doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Its power comes from truth. Even the faintest whisper of truth carries more weight than a storm of distortions. And the more you learn to sense that difference, the difference between the push of fear and the ease of alignment, the less likely you are to get swept back into the mind net. Many people expect inner guidance to feel like certainty, but most of the time, it feels more like honesty. A soft, quiet honesty that shows you what resonates and what doesn't. What opens you and what closes you. What feels aligned and what feels off. The signal rarely tells you what to do. It tells you what's true. And from that truth, the next step becomes clearer. Have you ever noticed how, when you're aligned with that inner truth, your body relaxes, your breath deepens, the mental fog lifts, you feel a little more present, a little more grounded. Those physical shifts are not random. They're signs that your awareness has reconnected with the deeper current inside you. And when that connection strengthens, something else begins to unfold. You start to differentiate between thoughts that carry truth and thoughts that carry distortion. You feel the difference between a thought that contracts you and a thought that expands you. You begin to see which impulses arise from fear and which arise from your deeper intelligence. This is the beginning of inner discernment, not a mental skill, but a felt sense, the capacity to sense the tone of truth inside you and follow it even when the world around you pulls in another direction. As this discernment grows, you'll start to recognize the moments when the signal is being bent or interrupted. And recognizing those moments is the first step in understanding the exact patterns of distortion that have been shaping your perception all along. From here, the journey naturally moves towards seeing those patterns clearly, not as enemies, but as influences that lose their power the moment they're brought into the light. When you begin sensing that quiet inner signal more clearly, something else becomes visible alongside it, almost like noticing a shadow, only after you've seen the light. You start realizing that not every impulse inside you rises with the same tone, the same depth, the same texture of truths. Some thoughts arrive with a familiar urgency, as if they've been living in your mind for years, even though they don't actually reflect who you are now. And, as strange as it sounds, the moment your inner clarity strengthens is often the moment these other influences become more noticeable. They don't arrive as intruders. They blend. They slip in wearing emotions you already recognize: anxiety, doubt, anticipation, caution. They attach themselves to old wounds, to old patterns, to old memories you never got the chance to question. And because they echo the same survival instincts you once needed, they feel legitimate. They feel like protection. They feel like common sense. These are the influence patterns we're naming here, not external monsters, but subtle currents that bend your perception just enough to pull you off center. They've been operating in the background for a long time, shaping your reactions, bending your interpretations, and distorting your sense of what's actually true for you, not because you're weak, but because these patterns work quietly. They hide behind familiarity. You can feel them most clearly in the moments when your clarity tries to rise. It's almost predictable. You sense a direction that feels deeply aligned, and seconds later, a counterthought arrives with surprising force. Something like, "Be careful," or "Who do you think you are?" Or it won't work this time. The timing is uncanny. The clarity appears, then the interruption appears right behind it, almost as if the clarity itself triggers the response. This is one of the most common influence patterns, the pattern of interference. It doesn't try to convince you that your inner knowing is wrong. It simply throws enough doubt at you that you hesitate. And once you hesitate, your attention drifts. And once your attention drifts, the clarity becomes harder to feel. This entire sequence can unfold in seconds, so fast you barely recognize what happened. One moment you were centered. The next moment you're second-guessing yourself without understanding why. Another pattern emerges through emotional amplification. The emotion may be real, but the scale of it isn't. A mild concern becomes a spiraling fear. A small mistake becomes a story about failure. An awkward moment becomes a full narrative about rejection. The influence doesn't create the emotion, it stretches it. It exaggerates it to the point where your body reacts as if something catastrophic is happening, even when nothing in your outer world justifies that intensity. This amplification pulls your awareness away from the quiet signal and into the emotional storm. And in that storm, everything looks distorted. You can't tell what's instinct and what's insecurity. You can't tell what's intuition and what's fear. You lose access to the part of you that sees clearly not because it left, but because your focus has been swallowed by the noise. There's also the pattern of substitution. This one is more subtle. It takes a genuine desire, a desire to grow, to heal, to reconnect with yourself, and replaces it with a distorted version that looks similar but doesn't carry the same energy. Maybe you feel inspired to make a change, but the influence replaces that inspiration with pressure. Or you feel a pull toward honesty, but the influence turns it into self-criticism. Or you feel ready to open your heart, but the influence injects fear right at the threshold. The substitution works because it uses your real desires as entry points. It mirrors them, twists them, and presents a distorted version that feels almost right. And almost right is often harder to notice than clearly wrong. The more you observe these patterns, the more you begin seeing that they behave like currents, predictable, repeatable, mechanical. They don't adapt to your growth. They simply repeat what they have always done. And that repetition is what finally exposes them. You start recognizing the same emotional spiral before it fully forms. You notice the same intrusive doubt the moment it enters. You catch the same familiar tightening in your chest that used to pass unnoticed. This recognition doesn't make you immune to the patterns, but it does change your relationship with them. Instead of collapsing into the distortion, you begin pausing. You sense the difference between your voice and the voice that imitates yours. You feel when a thought is pulling you inward toward truth, and when it's pulling you outward toward confusion. And in that pause, something powerful happens. The influence loses its authority, not because you fight it, but because you see it. These patterns survive on identification. They dissolve under awareness. The moment you say, "This isn't mine," the pattern begins to unravel. Because clarity, even a small amount of it, cuts through distortion like light through fog. As this awareness strengthens, you start noticing another shift. The illusions these patterns rely on don't hold the same weight anymore. They fall apart more quickly. They reveal their seams. And once you begin recognizing that illusion, you're already stepping into the next stage of the journey, the moment when those patterns begin to lose their grip because you're seeing them for what they truly are. A bending of perception, not a truth of your being. Once you begin seeing how those influence patterns repeat themselves, something inside you naturally starts to lean back, not away in fear, but back into a deeper vantage point. Almost as if you're stepping out of the swirl and realizing that the storm you've been reacting to isn't as solid as it once felt. Thoughts that used to carry weight now feel lighter. Emotions that used to swallow your attention now reveal their edges. And in that quiet shift, the illusion behind them begins to show. It's strange how quickly a thought can take shape. One moment it's a quiet suggestion. The next it's a full narrative with tone, urgency, and consequences. The illusion isn't that the thought exists. The illusion is how convincingly it presents itself as truth. Most people never see that difference. They feel a thought rise, and because it arrives inside their own mind, they assume it must be real. They assume it belongs to them. They assume it reflects something meaningful about their life. But if you slow down enough to really notice a thought, not analyze it, just notice it, something remarkable happens. You begin to sense that it has a flavor, a direction, an emotional texture. Some thoughts feel grounded, like they're rising from your center. Others feel scattered, like they're built from fragments of fear or memory. And this subtle difference, once you start sensing it, changes the entire relationship you have with your inner world. Most illusions fall apart under observation. It's not the thinking that traps you, it's the unexamined acceptance. A thought that feels absolute begins to soften the moment you question its authority. You don't need to debate it or prove it wrong. Simply seeing it as a possibility, not a certainty, is enough to weaken its grip. You've probably experienced this without realizing it. Think of a moment when you spiraled into self-doubt or tension, convinced that something was about to go wrong. But later, when the moment passed, you looked back and thought, "Why did I believe that so strongly?" The intensity felt real, but the conclusion didn't hold up. That gap between feeling and truth, that's the illusion. Breaking the illusion doesn't mean suppressing your thoughts. It means recognizing the difference between a thought with truth in it and a thought that's simply loud. A loud thought creates urgency. A true thought creates clarity. And once you start sensing which is which, the illusion collapses from the inside. There's a moment many people reach on this path, a moment when they realize that most of their suffering didn't come from what happened in their life, but from the stories their mind told about what happened. The interpretations, the predictions, the assumptions, the imagined outcomes. These stories aren't wrong, they're just incomplete. They're not rooted in your deeper self. They're shaped by old wounds playing themselves out in your present. When you recognize that, the illusion loses momentum. You stop running with every story your mind generates. You stop assuming that a thought appearing inside you has the right to define you. And the more you see this, the more compassion you feel toward yourself. Because you realize you were never broken, you were simply believing thoughts that didn't belong to you. There's a kind of inner spaciousness that appears as this illusion breaks down. A moment where a thought rises, and instead of reacting, you simply witness it. No collapse, no spiral, no tightening, just awareness. And in that awareness, the thought loses its urgency. You feel a kind of quiet authority returning to you, subtle at first, but unmistakably real. This is the shift from identification to observation. You once lived inside of your thoughts, unable to see outside the narrative. Now, you're watching the narrative unfold from a different vantage point. The thoughts still come, but they don't sweep you away. The emotions still arise, but they don't drown you. You begin noticing the seams between stimulus and reaction, and in those seams, you find freedom. Breaking the illusion doesn't end your inner challenges, but it changes the terrain. Instead of being pulled by every current, you start to sense the deeper flow beneath it all, the path that feels honest, the tone that feels aligned, the direction that feels like it's coming from the part of you that doesn't bend. And as the illusion continues to unravel, something even more meaningful begins to surface, a quiet recognition that your inner authority is not lost. It's been here all along, waiting beneath the noise for the moment you could finally feel it again. From here, the journey shifts toward reclaiming that authority not as a concept, but as a lived reality, a way of navigating your inner world with a steadiness that distortions can't imitate. As the illusion around your thoughts begins to loosen, there's a quiet moment almost imperceptible when you realize you're no longer standing inside the noise. You're standing behind it, watching it, feeling it pass through without automatically assuming it carries truth. And in that shift, something familiar begins to rise in you, not loud, not forceful, more like the reappearance of a strength you forgot you had, a steady presence that feels unmistakably your own. That presence is what inner authority feels like. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand obedience. It doesn't puff up or posture. It simply returns, as though it never actually left, only waited for you to step far enough back from the mental chaos to notice it again. Inner authority isn't dominance. It isn't control. It isn't the rigid insistence that you must always know what you're doing. It's the opposite. It's the quiet sense that you can trust the part of you that sees without fear, without distortion, without the need to justify itself. It's the grounded awareness that rises when you're no longer fused with every passing emotion or every familiar doubt. You've felt this before, even if only in flashes, those moments when you made a decision without having to explain it, when you walked away from something that drained you, even though it made no logical sense to anyone else, when you sensed the truth about a person or situation before you had evidence, when you held steady while everything around you pushed for a reaction. Those weren't accidents. They were glimpses of the inner authority that's been buried under layers of conditioning, survival patterns, and other people's expectations. When this authority begins to return, it doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with presence. You start noticing that your reactions slow down, that you don't collapse into old fears as quickly, that you're able to question thoughts that used to control you. And the more you sense this inner steadiness, the more you realize how long you've lived without it, not because you lacked strength, but because you handed that strength to thoughts that never deserved it. There's something deeply human about understanding that your inner authority was always there, even when you didn't feel it. It waited through all the moments you doubted yourself, through all the choices you made from fear instead of clarity, through all the times you trusted someone else's voice above your own. It endured the noise. It endured the pressure. It endured the confusion. And now, as you reclaim it, the return feels less like gaining something new and more like remembering something ancient. You might feel this remembering in small ways at first. A thought that once triggered panic now feels hollow. A criticism that once hit deeply now barely grazes you. A familiar insecurity rises, but for the first time, you don't automatically believe it. You hear the tone. You recognize the distortion. You feel the disconnect between the thought and your truth. That awareness is the beginning of sovereignty. Not sovereignty over the world, but sovereignty over the one landscape that determines how you experience the world, your inner one. As this sovereignty deepens, you might notice a subtle shift in how you hold yourself. Not physically, though. Sometimes that changes too, but emotionally. You stop abandoning yourself in small moments. You stop outsourcing your clarity to people who don't live with the consequences of your choices. You stop allowing fear to narrate your life. You stop letting your history define your identity. This doesn't mean the old patterns vanish. They still show up. They still whisper. They still try to bend your attention toward familiar narratives. But the difference now is that they no longer speak with authority. They sound like echoes instead of commands. And when a pattern returns, you meet it with something you didn't have before. the ability to stand in your center without being pulled into the noise. You begin asking quieter, more honest questions. Does this thought actually reflect who I am now? Is this fear telling the truth or repeating the past? Is this impulse aligned, or is it a pattern replaying itself? Questions like these aren't strategies. They are signals that your authority is waking up, because only someone who has stepped back into their own center can question the legitimacy of their own thoughts without collapsing under them. And it's here in this growing clarity that the deeper transformation begins. When your authority returns, your perception changes. Choices that once felt impossible become simple. Boundaries that once felt harsh become natural. Honesty that once felt risky becomes necessary. And the life you've been trying to create from the outside begins taking shape from within. You feel yourself moving not from impulse, not from panic, not from distortion, but from alignment. And alignment is what carries you into the next revealing. The realization that perception is not random, that it follows laws, patterns, and inner mechanics that shape how you experience everything. Understanding those laws doesn't just deepen your clarity, it changes the entire way you live inside yourself. As your inner authority settles back into place, you may notice something unexpected starting to unfold, almost like discovering that the landscape inside you has a structure you never realized was there. What once felt chaotic begins to reveal its patterns. What once seemed random starts to organize itself. Your thoughts, emotions, and interpretations no longer appear as isolated events. They start behaving like a system, shaped by subtle laws that have been operating within you long before you had the words to name them. You don't learn these laws the way you learn information. You recognize them. They show themselves through experience, through reflection, through the growing clarity with which you observe your own mind. And the more clearly you see them, the more empowered you become, not because the world outside changes, but because you finally understand how meaning forms inside you. One of the first laws you begin sensing is the law of reflection, not the mirror you know from the physical world, but the inner one where whatever is active in your awareness gets projected onto the world around you. When your mind is weighed down by old fear, everything looks threatening. When your heart is holding unspoken grief, neutral moments feel personal. When you're aligned with your deeper truth, opportunities appear where barriers once stood. It's not that the world changes, it's that your perception adjusts to reflect the state of your inner field. Think of the times when a single worry shaped your entire day. The world didn't become dangerous. You were looking at it through the lens of danger. Or the times when you were at peace internally and even difficult moments felt lighter, not because they were easier, but because your perception wasn't filtered through overwhelm. Once you see this, it becomes impossible to ignore. Your inner condition is shaping your outer interpretation. Then there's the law of activation. Whatever you give your attention to gains momentum. A single thought, when revisited enough times, becomes a belief. A belief rehearsed long enough becomes a lens, and once a lens forms, everything you encounter gets filtered through it. If the lens was shaped by pain, the world becomes a map of your wounds. If the lens was shaped by truth, the world becomes a field of direction. You've lived this law more than you realize. When you dwell on fear, the fear grows not because it's accurate, but because you keep feeding it. When you reconnect with a moment of inner steadiness, the steadiness expands not through effort, but through attention. The activation doesn't care what you focus on. It simply amplifies whatever receives your energy. This is why random thoughts can spiral so quickly. Not because they're powerful, but because attention gives them life. Another law reveals itself in the way your inner experiences begin to cluster, the law of coherence. Your inner world wants to organize itself around whatever carries the strongest emotional charge. If unresolved pain is the loudest force inside you, then your thoughts and reactions will unconsciously orbit around that pain. If fear holds the most weight, your decisions will bend around fear, even when you don't realize it. But when clarity becomes the strongest resonance in your awareness, everything reorganizes around it. Doubts lose intensity. Emotions lose volatility. Old wounds lose their ability to dictate your choices. You begin sensing the difference between emotional truth and emotional habit, between what you genuinely know and what you've been conditioned to believe. Coherence is the point where inner alignment begins to reshape the entire architecture of your perception. And as these laws become more clear, something else begins to happen. Instead of feeling like a passenger in your own mind, you start moving through your inner world with a kind of gentle precision. You can feel when you're viewing life through an old lens. You notice when your attention is activating a story you no longer want to live inside. You sense when your emotional center has shifted and your perception has followed it. None of this requires force. It requires seeing, because once you understand these laws, not with your mind, but with your awareness, you begin to navigate from a deeper place. A place where you're no longer reacting to every wave inside you, but guiding your attention in ways that support your clarity. You're no longer confused by the noise because you understand the mechanics behind it. You're no longer overwhelmed by your emotions because you can feel how they move, how they swell, how they recede. You become fluent in your own inner landscape, and that fluency changes everything. Your reactions soften. Your decisions become more intentional. Your self-trust strengthens. You begin living from your inner center rather than the moving surface of your mind. But as this clarity deepens, another layer of the journey appears, one that asks you to turn toward the parts of yourself that still carry tension, still move from fear, still hold the remnants of old wounds, not to judge them, but to understand them. Because healing the split within doesn't happen by accident. It happens when the deeper self meets the conditioned self with the kind of honesty that brings both into the light. And that meeting is where we go next. As you start recognizing the laws that shape your perception, something deeper begins to come into view, not outside you, but in the quiet inner terrain where your reactions, beliefs, and instincts take shape. You realize there's a subtle divide running through your inner world, not dramatic, not destructive, but real. A pull between two versions of you, the one shaped by memory, fear, and conditioning, and the one shaped by clarity, intuition, and the quiet intelligence you've been reconnecting with. This split isn't proof that something is wrong with you. If anything, it explains why you've felt torn so many times, why certain choices, even small ones, felt like internal negotiations, why part of you wanted to grow while another part wanted to stay hidden, why you could feel deep truth in one moment and old doubt in the next. You weren't conflicted because you were lost. You were conflicted because two different internal systems were trying to steer the same life. The conditioned self moves quickly. Its instincts were formed in moments when survival felt more important than truth. It learned to scan for danger, to anticipate rejection, to avoid risk, to read the room before it read your own heart. Its strategies weren't mistakes, they were adaptations, ways you kept yourself safe before you had the ability to understand what safety actually meant for you. And because those strategies worked once, your mind stored them as defaults. But the part of you that's been awakening, the remembering self, carries a different orientation. It doesn't rush. It doesn't catastrophize. It doesn't operate from fear. It observes from a depth that the conditioned self hasn't learned to trust yet. This deeper self doesn't want you to survive your life. It wants you to live it. Not cautiously, but honestly. Not reactively, but consciously. You can feel the difference between the two when you slow down enough to sense the tone beneath your thoughts. The conditioned self tightens you. The remembering self expands you. The conditioned self uses urgency as its language. The remembering self uses alignment. One fuels anxiety, the other fuels clarity. And as you feel these contrasts, you begin to see that healing isn't about destroying the conditioned part. It's about rebalancing the relationship between these two selves. Healing the split within starts when you stop treating your conditioned reactions as enemies. They're not trying to sabotage you. They're trying to protect you using outdated information. When you react sharply, shut down emotionally, or slip into old patterns, it's not because you've failed. It's because the conditioned self thinks you're still living in the past. It remembers. It hasn't yet realized that you're capable of responding from a different level of awareness. As your clarity grows, you begin responding to those old reactions with something new, curiosity instead of shame, awareness instead of a collapsing, gentleness instead of self-judgment. And the moment you respond differently, the dynamic changes. The conditioned self stops feeling like it's fighting for control. It starts realizing it doesn't need to lead anymore. You've likely already felt small moments of this, times when an old trigger showed up, but instead of spiraling, you paused. Times when a familiar insecurity surfaced, but you heard it without believing it. Times when a deeply rooted fear rose, but something in you stayed anchored. These moments might have felt subtle, but they are evidence of profound healing, not because the trigger disappeared, but because you were no longer defined by it. Healing isn't the erasing of wounds. It's the reorganization of inner power. As this reorganization unfolds, you might sense internal conversations you didn't notice before. The conditioned self voicing worry, the remembering self offering reassurance, the conditioned self imagining worst-case scenarios, the remembering self sensing a deeper truth underneath. These inner dialogues aren't signs of fragmentation, they're signs of integration. Two parts of you finally meeting each other with honesty instead of confusion. And slowly, the remembering self begins guiding the parts that once felt stuck, not with pressure, but with presence, not with demands, but with awareness. The conditioned self learns that it doesn't have to brace for impact anymore. The remembering self learns how to lead with compassion, and the space between them, the split that once felt like an inner fracture, becomes the ground where healing takes root. Eventually, you start feeling something that doesn't come from either part alone. Wholeness, a sense of being internally consistent, even when you're uncertain. A sense of belonging to yourself, even when life becomes unpredictable. A sense of steadiness that doesn't depend on circumstances. And in that steadiness, something powerful happens. The parts of you that once avoided discomfort begin to open. The parts of you that once clung to fear begin to loosen. And the parts of you that once felt broken begin to feel understood. What once felt like inner conflict becomes inner alignment, not perfect, not finished, but real. From here, the path naturally leads toward the moments that test this alignment, the moments when life heats up, when pressure returns, when the old wounds make their last attempts to pull you back, not to break you, but to reveal the parts of you that are now strong enough to walk through the inner fire without losing yourself. There comes a point in every inner transformation when life stops feeling like a mental exercise and starts touching something much more real inside you. Not because circumstances suddenly shift, but because your awareness has grown sensitive enough to feel the tension between who you once were and who you're becoming. That tension has a heat to it, a purifying kind of heat. And when you step into it, It feels like walking through an inner fire, the kind that doesn't burn your essence, only the stories that no longer fit. This fire isn't here to punish you or test your worth. It's here to illuminate. It brings forward the beliefs you've outgrown, the fears you've inherited, the emotions you've tucked into quiet corners, hoping they would fade on their own. Instead of fading, they waited. And when this fire rises, those old pieces step forward, not because you're backsliding, but because you're finally strong enough to face them without losing yourself. Many people misunderstand this stage. They think the return of old emotions means they've regressed. But if you pay attention, you'll notice something different happening now. The emotions may be intense, but they don't swallow you. The fear may speak, but it doesn't dictate. The thoughts may race, but their authority feels thinner. You're not being dragged under, you're witnessing. And that witnessing is a sign of how much power has already returned to you. There's an honesty in this fire that you don't find anywhere else. It strips away the comfortable illusions, the explanations you've used to soften the truth, the narratives that kept you from seeing yourself clearly. It doesn't shame you. It reveals the places that are asking to be met with presence rather than avoidance. Standing in this fire, you start seeing the origins of certain reactions. The moment someone raises their voice and your chest tightens, not because of the present moment, but because your body remembers something from long ago. The way you hesitate to speak your truth, not because it's unsafe now, but because once it was. The way you brace for disappointment, not because failure is inevitable, but because you've experienced it enough times that expectation became habit. The fire shows these patterns without flinching. And strangely, instead of feeling overwhelmed, something inside you softens as you recognize them. You see the ways you have protected yourself. You see the versions of you that held the weight when no one else could. You see the brilliance in your survival, even in its messiest forms. And in that recognition, the fire starts transforming into something else less like danger, more like clarity rising through heat. At a certain point, you'll feel the remembering self stepping forward in a way it hasn't before. Not to override the conditioned self, and not to silence it, but to stand beside it, to say, in its steady, grounded way, I'm here now. You don't have to carry this alone anymore. And something remarkable happens when those two parts stand in the same fire. The tension between them eases. The conditioned self stops trying to escape. The remembering self stops trying to bypass. What remains is a kind of quiet integration. This is where real inner strength emerges. Not the strength that denies emotion, but the strength that can hold emotion without collapsing. The strength that stays open, even when the past rises with intensity. The strength that understands pain as a movement through you, not a definition of you. This strength doesn't shout. It anchors. And when the fire begins to settle, you'll feel a shift, not an epiphany, not a dramatic breakthrough. More like a subtle rearrangement inside your chest, a loosening, a widening, a sense of breath returning to places that once felt constricted. It's the moment when your inner world reorganizes not around fear, but around truth. Sometimes the softening that follows is so gentle you might miss it if you aren't paying attention. A thought that used to hook you now floats by without impact. A memory that once clenched your heart now feels like something you can look at without reliving. The narratives that once dictated your reactions begin to move into the background. It's as though the fire has thinned the walls around them, allowing light to move through. And in that softened space, something else begins to stir quietly, almost shyly. A sense that the story you've been carrying inside you isn't fixed, that it can be revised, reshaped, understood in new ways, not by force, and not by denial, but by bringing the same clarity you carried through the fire into the places where your inner story was first written. It doesn't announce itself as a new beginning. It arrives more like the first breeze after a storm, a gentle reminder that the landscape has changed, even if you haven't fully seen it yet. And when that breeze moves through you, you feel the subtle invitation to look at your inner narrative with new eyes, as if the fire has made space for a truth that was always waiting beneath the ash. When that quiet breeze moves through you after the fire, it carries something subtle, an awareness that your inner world is no longer arranged the way it once was. The old stories feel loosened, as if the heat softened the glue holding them in place. And in that loosened state, you begin to sense that the narrative you've lived inside for so long was never fixed. It was inherited, assembled, shaped by moments of pain and moments of misunderstanding. It grew around the wounds that didn't yet have a voice and the fears that didn't yet have context. You don't rewrite your narrative by forcing new words into place. You rewrite it by seeing the old words clearly for the first time, seeing the places where you confused survival with identity, where you mistook silence for strength, where you accepted interpretations that belong to someone else's perspective rather than your own truth. Most inner stories are formed long before we're capable of questioning them. A child doesn't understand the complexity of an adult's anger. They simply conclude, "I'm the problem." A young heart experiencing abandonment doesn't grasp the other person's wounds. They conclude, "I'm not worth staying for." A teenager criticized at the wrong moment doesn't question the critic. They internalize the judgment. These moments stack quietly until they become a lens, and that lens becomes a story. And stories, when left unexamined, start behaving like reality. But now that you've walked through the inner fire and felt the strength of your remembering self, those old narratives can't hide in the same way. They reveal themselves not as truth, but as interpretations you once needed to make sense of experiences that were too overwhelming to process. And when you notice that, the whole story begins to shift. Sometimes the rewrite begins in the smallest moment. A memory returns, but instead of collapsing into it, you observe it from the self you've grown into. You sense details you didn't notice before, not the pain itself, but the innocence behind it, not the failure, but the effort, not the rejection, but the wound behind the other person's behavior. The moment you see those nuances, the story begins to take on new meaning. And it's the meaning that heals, not the memory. You may find yourself realizing that you weren't weak. You were protecting yourself the only way you knew how. You weren't unworthy. You were shaped by people who couldn't recognize their own worth either. You weren't difficult. You were sensitive in a world that rewarded numbness. And suddenly, the entire internal architecture tilts. Not dramatically, but profoundly. When you rewrite the inner narrative from this deeper perspective, you're not erasing your past. You're reclaiming authorship. You're taking the pen out of the hands of fear, shame, and old conditioning and placing it back where it always belonged. This isn't about creating a story where you're flawless. It's about creating a story where you're whole. Wholeness doesn't mean perfection. It means transparency. It means your inner world is no longer divided between the parts you accept and the parts you hide. It means you're willing to see the full truth of yourself, not the polished version, not the protected version, but the real one. And the real one is far more resilient than the narrative you inherited. As your awareness moves deeper into your story, you may notice that certain chapters carry emotional gravity simply because you've never questioned them. When you bring curiosity into those heavy places, something begins to uncoil. The narrative loosens even further. The moment you name a belief, "I always end up alone. I'm too much. I never get it right." You can feel the distance between the belief and the truth. It's subtle at first, but unmistakable. A belief that once felt like a law now feels like residue, and residue can be washed away. This is where the remembering self becomes invaluable. It doesn't rewrite the narrative intellectually. It rewrites it energetically. It feels what is true and what is inherited. It feels what expands you and what constricts you. It feels the difference between your own voice and the voices that shaped your early years. And when it speaks, its tone carries a clarity that the old story can't match. Sometimes the rewrite happens through a simple shift in posture, a moment where you stand a little taller, because something inside you knows, that story isn't mine anymore. Sometimes it happens through a breath, one deep exhale, that releases a weight you didn't realize you were still carrying. Sometimes it happens through the smallest act of honesty, telling yourself, I deserved better, and feeling the truth of that land in your chest. Rewriting the inner narrative is not a single moment. It's a gentle unraveling. It's the soft remapping of your identity around your healed awareness rather than your old wounds. The story begins to feel lighter, softer, more aligned, not because you've changed the facts, but because you've reclaimed their meaning. And as that meaning reorganizes, something quiet begins to open in you, a new pathway, a new inner direction, a new sense of possibility. Not loud, not dramatic, more like the way dawn breaks soft, gradual, steady, illuminating what was always there beneath the night. And in that first light, you start sensing the shape of a life that moves from your deeper truths, not the narrative that once confined you, a life where each choice, each step, each breath begins aligning with the self you've been steadily uncovering beneath all the noise. As the first light of that new inner landscape settles, something inside you begins to feel different, not in a sudden, explosive way, but in a slow, steady shift that's almost easier to sense than to describe. You start noticing that the space between thought and reaction has widened. The old patterns still try to surface, but they no longer grip you with the same force. The emotions that once overwhelmed you now move through you with less resistance. And beneath it all, there's a steadiness, a groundedness that feels like a quiet homecoming, living beyond the mind. Net isn't about achieving some untouchable state where you never feel fear again, or doubt again, or pressure again. Life still moves. Challenges still come. Your inner world still shifts with its own seasons. But the difference now is simple and profound. You no longer mistake every inner movement as a command. You don't hand authority to every thought that appears. You don't collapse into every emotion that rises. You move with an awareness that wasn't available to you before. There's a kind of inner spaciousness that becomes your new baseline. You're still aware of the noise when it appears, but the noise doesn't define your reality. A thought passes through and you feel its texture sharp, soft, heavy, hollow, but you no longer fuse with it. You sense whether it comes from fear or from clarity. You feel its origin instead of letting it dictate your direction. That sensing becomes a quiet compass, one you can trust even when the world around you feels uncertain. You might begin noticing the way your body responds differently too. The tension that once lived in your shoulders starts to loosen. The knots in your stomach unravel more quickly. The breath you used to hold without noticing becomes deeper, fuller, more natural. Your whole system begins moving as if it finally has permission to stop bracing for impact. And in that shift, you start seeing people differently as well. You notice how often others are speaking from their wounds rather than their truth. You hear the fear behind their anger, the longing behind their defenses, the confusion behind their certainty. You no longer take their reactions as reflections of your worth. Their narratives no longer dictate your identity. You meet them from a place of steadiness, not superiority, not distance, just clarity. That clarity opens doors inside you that were once sealed shut. You find yourself making choices that align with your deeper intelligence rather than your old conditioning. You say no when you mean no. You say yes when something resonates, even if it scares you. You stop apologizing for boundaries that protect your inner landscape. You move with a quiet, natural confidence, not the kind that needs to be seen, but the kind that lives in your posture, in your breath, in the way you carry yourself through the world. Living beyond the mind net also means you're no longer governed by the momentum of the past. You can feel when old wounds try to retell their stories. But instead of being pulled into them, you simply acknowledge them like old acquaintances passing through. You understand that healing doesn't erase history, it transforms your relationship to it. What once felt like a cage becomes context. What once felt like fate becomes insight. What once controlled you becomes something you can hold without losing your center. And the more you live from this awareness, the more natural it becomes. Not an effort, not a technique, a way of being, a way of moving through yourself without abandoning yourself, a way of walking through the world without losing the inner signal that has been guiding you from the beginning. There will still be moments when the noise rises, when fear whispers, when doubt tries to bend your perception, but those moments no longer mark the edge of your capacity. They're simply reminders, small signals that invite you to return to the clarity beneath the surface. And you know how to return now. You've walked through fire. You've watched illusions fall apart. You've felt the remembering self rise through confusion. The strength you carry today isn't borrowed. It's earned, quietly, inwardly, and as it continues to deepen, you begin understanding something that can only be realized through lived experience. Freedom doesn't come from having a perfect mind. It comes from no longer being ruled by the parts of your mind that never knew who you were in the first place. And in that realization, the path doesn't end. It expands into a life guided not by pressure or performance or fear, but by alignment, truth, and the steady presence of the self you've reclaimed from the inside out. The pace softens here, like stepping out of a long conversation into an evening breeze. You've traveled through layers of your own inner world, sometimes gently, sometimes through heat, sometimes through clarity that surprised you with its honesty. And now, as the journey settles, there's a quiet space waiting for you. A space where you can feel everything you've touched without rushing to define it or use it or fix anything with it. Just breathe here for a moment. Let the stillness gather. Let yourself feel how different your inner landscape is from when you first began. You're not trying to grasp anything. You're simply recognizing what's already shifted, subtle, real, and unmistakably yours. You've seen how the mind bends under old patterns. You've seen how clarity rises beneath the noise. You've walked through fire without abandoning yourself. You've witnessed the narratives that once defined you soften in the presence of awareness. And now, standing here, you can sense something steady beneath it all, something that doesn't need to be proven or named. It's the part of you that stayed with you through every chapter, even the ones you thought you wouldn't make it through. This presence isn't a destination. It's a return, a coming home to the quiet knowing that's been guiding you long before you had language for it. And as you sit with this awareness, just notice how naturally your breath settles, how gently your thoughts move, how grounded your body feels as it remembers the steadiness inside you. You don't need to hold on to this moment. It will meet you again. Every time you listen inward, every time you slow down enough to feel truth beneath the noise, every time you choose alignment over fear. For now, just rest in the knowing that you've come closer to yourself and that this closeness is the kind of strength no distortion can ever take away.